God and Other Delicacies has a weekly newsletter. If you'd like to subscribe, email me at godsdelicateshow@gmail.com and I'll put you on the list. Hello, everyone. Welcome to God and Other Delicacies. I'm Nicholas D'Augusto. Thanks a lot for being here. I've got another great guest on tap today. We're going to talk about God. That's what we do here. Let's get into it. Today, I have the privilege of welcoming Ronald Peterson to the show. Dr. Ronald Peterson is a retired OBGYN from Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he practiced for 40 years and delivered between 5,000 and 6,000 babies. His father was a Lutheran pastor whose religious focus was missionary work, bringing gospel to new neighborhoods. Ronald and I are meeting each other for the first time today, but he's the father to a dear friend of mine, Amy, and I'm thrilled that he's here to share his story with me. Welcome, Dr. Peterson.
Thank you, Nick. Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure having you. I was really excited when Amy reached out to me that she thought that you might be interested. It's a really, it's a new experience for me because the show is relatively new. But I haven't had an opportunity to only one other person I've had on the show that I've never met before. And
always risky.
Yeah, right. Well, actually, those are the most fun because every question is new to me, so, or every answer at least. So that's really fun. And you're coming from an occupation that you have a totally different perspective than I'm used to. So I'm excited to get to talk to you.
Good.
Just a couple of things. You're an avid lover of history. We were talking a little bit about this before. I didn't mention this to you, but I have a bachelor's degree in history as well as theater. So you and I share that love of history. And you're a dedicated gardener.
Right.
Now, do you have how much land do you have to garden?
It's a small plot.
Yeah.
So, which is good because it's all filled with flowers.
Okay, good. Oh, I didn't know. You're not vegetables.
I'm not vegetables. It's
okay,
just flowers.
So you're into flowers.
So I have clematis and...
Are you one of those guys that will clip the flowers and put them in your house?
Yes.
Oh, okay, cool. Because some people don't.
No, my wife forces me to do
Okay. If you could choose, though, you'd leave them on the
Probably.
plant? Okay.
Probably.
Well, that's really fun. All right, good. That's just a little teeny tiny thing that I get to needle into. Okay, so before we get into all the backstory and history stuff, it's very important for me to always know what you ate for breakfast this morning.
Well, we're staying at the Hyatt Place.
Oh, okay.
And I had a great Midwest American meal with scrambled eggs, bacon, potatoes, grapefruit juice, and
excellent.
English muffin.
Oh, I love an English muffin. I love the grapefruit juice. I feel like that's a really nice curveball. Not everybody chooses grapefruit. A lot of orange out there.
Yep.
That's
right.
But grapefruit's very unsung. It's an unsung hero of the juices.
That's right. Two big tall glasses.
Okay. Because they don't refill those for free, Well, no, they do at the hotel.
It's a buffet.
It's a buffet at the hotel,
You can eat as much as you like.
That's why you got to, because if you had to pay for it at a restaurant, it'd be $5 a piece.
Exactly.
That's right. Okay, very good. Well, Ron, let's just jump in because there's lots of fun stuff to talk about here. The show always kicks off with this question: how and when were you introduced to the idea of God in your life?
Well, I sort of grew up with God.
Yes.
In that, with my dad being a pastor, my dad met my mother in northern Wisconsin at his first parish.
Where in northern Wisconsin?
There was a little town called Ogema, O-G-E-M-A.
So my wife is from outside of Green Bay.
Okay.
So she's from a little town on the way to Door County called Dykesville.
Okay.
Which, of course, is rampant.
So she's
with
a Packer
jokes.
fan.
She's a Packer fan.
Yes.
Is that near any of that? Is it near Appleton?
It's in Price County. No, it's in central Wisconsin.
Central. So it's south of Appleton, south of Green. It's in between.
No, it's on Highway 13.
Okay.
And
some of this stuff I don't know.
Right. It's in central Wisconsin, and there were three parishes. Ogema was where he lived, and then there was Prentice, which was about 8 miles north, and Westboro, which is about 6 or 7 miles south.
Okay.
And so he would have to do 3 sermons in a morning and run in a 1948 whatever car he had between the 3 congregations to make 3 different services. So he was a busy guy. So one of the things that I sort of teased at the beginning of the show, and what you were kind of helping me understand, is he's a missionary pastor. This guy was a very proactive
religious leader in the community. I mean, he was starting religious communities, essentially.
He did subsequently. This was his first parish.
How young is he at this time? I mean, you're not born
was
yet.
20? Was he about 24? You know, it was during World War II, and so they accelerated the seminaries a little bit so that he actually got out maybe a year ahead of time.
Huh.
And,
they accelerated the seminaries. Why are they accelerating
Well,
them?
because the churches didn't have pastors to fill the pulpits.
Because the pastors are going to war?
Could be.
Wow.
And so my mother was a school teacher, daughter of a banker, and her house was, just down the street from the parsonage. And so he'd walk by.
Hold on, define parsonage again, remember?
Parsonage is where the preacher lives.
Okay, yeah.
So the
good.
church.
I'm Catholic, so I like these words are not the same.
Well, so the church generally owns a home for the pastor. At least they did in those days.
Sure.
And so this was the parsonage, and so he'd walk by my mother every day, and she'd try to be out, I think, at the same time. And so there was a romance that eventually occurred, and so they were married in June of 1944, which is about a year after
he arrived there,
Right.
and so he's 25 at that time, or something. And then how old was she? She younger than him?
He was born in 1920. She was in 1923.
So she was like 20 or 21.
22
when she met him.
sorry.
Yeah. Cool.
Because I think it was 1945 they got married. In June, if I remember right.
So he grew up in Illinois, and then does that mean that like his congregation where he is at in Illinois sort of, he grows up in the seminary, and the church then the organization sends him up there.
So he grew up on a farm.
Okay.
Just outside of Rock Island in Illinois, which is right where the Mississippi and the Rock joined, and near a town called Andover.
Okay.
And his mother and dad owned a farm there, and he grew up there with his brother Ken, who was, working in Knoxville, Tennessee, actually on the atomic bomb. So I mean, these were
wow.
And
what a time!
It was a time of rationing, and for example, my dad had special ration cards because he was a farmer, which was they needed gasoline to produce crops for the troops and so on and so forth. So sometimes when he was a pastor, he would get extra ration cards. The seminary professors would ask him, "Could you give me another ration card for?"
Wow.
But they were interesting times,
to
say the least.
Yeah, right.
And so his first call then, when he completed his degree, was to this northern Wisconsin town. All these are Swedish. This is Augustana, which is a Swedish Lutheran church at that time.
Would he have spoken Swedish?
He was the first pastor in Ogama that did not speak Swedish.
Okay, so he was like he's a
groundbreaker.
Did your grandparents were they born in Sweden?
My mother's father was born in Sweden. He came over at age 16.
Okay.
And his wife was there, but her parents had been born in Sweden.
Yeah.
The town where,
This is similar to my great-grandparents' story, which is Italian, but it's...
The town where they grew up, the Sioux Line, which is the train, was a lumber train, and it was a busy, growing community at that time, which was quite vibrant. My grandfather, my mother's dad, was the banker, and the bank was just down the street.
Of course.
He was and he was on the church board and so on and so forth. He was a big fisherman, which is, I eventually assumed his luck, to fish, which I love to do.
Yeah,
so.
Beautiful. Well, you're in such a beautiful part of the country for fishing. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a man who. So your father doesn't come from a line of religious seekers.
No.
He has an epiphany kind of as a young man.
Well, my grandmother, his mother, was quite religious.
Okay.
And, my grandfather, who died at age 52 of asthma.
Right.
Right.
I mean, that's the sort of thing that could
so
kill
the
you.
grandma really ran the farm. She was somebody who was a clear-headed business thinker and very faithful and an active member of the church in Orion, and probably was the impetus for him going to the seminary.
Yeah.
In fact, she had me pegged for the seminary when I was growing up. But
Wow. Well, we'll hear more about that.
I had to disappoint her, but anyway.
Yes. Well, I understand. So when do you enter in then? So like, what's your father's story?
So then
and how many siblings do you have? And
yeah, so I was born in 1947.
Okay. So not long after they're married. You're the eldest then?
I'm the oldest.
Okay.
My brother followed 11 months later in 1948.
Not wasting any time.
And so, and I was very close to my grandparents because my grandfather, they were right down the street, and, I can remember those times, but I can't remember any necessarily God then. But with having a new marriage, eventually he had to move out of town, and so then he was called to a new parish that they were starting in Gary, Indiana. And so I do have memories of moving to Gary.
So you're born in Wisconsin.
Born in Wisconsin.
And one thing I forgot to say is your mother was the organist.
Well, she played piano.
Oh, she played piano.
But she organ as well.
Okay.
And in those days everybody played piano.
I guess I didn't know that.
Yeah, well, at least in these small towns.
Yeah, like everybody just like that was the thing everybody taught everybody.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So I mean, my aunt.
That was your music education.
Well,
that was
something
education.
Girls did.
How interesting.
My aunt, my grandmother in Illinois, sister was a piano teacher, for example. And
I mean, I don't want to derail this, but that's amazing. Are you saying that basically, like, one of the things that was just kind of culturally normal is that a young girl's education would include piano education, like every girl?
And I don't know about that, but it did in our family. Yeah.
But or like it's relatively common. It's not like today where you go in and you're like, there's 20 instruments here, pick which one you want. It's kind of like, we've got a piano, you're going to learn how to play the piano.
Right.
Okay, wow. So your mother was also very faithful and she dovetailed her work with your father's work.
Right. She was very supportive.
Yeah. And then would also participate in the services because
she
was singing.
She was a high school teacher of business education at the Prentice High School.
Right, okay.
And so that's how they met. And then, again, after a few years, they moved to Gary and were called to this new parish. And it was the pastor who was the head of the church of a church in Gary had my father as an intern in Kansas City. So that's how he knew who he was and so on and so forth. So then they moved down to Gary. And the new church was just south of the U.S. Steel Mills on 11th Avenue.
Okay.
In Gary.
I love that. Anybody that is from Gary or has been to Gary that knows this, I love that they can picture this. I'm just sort of like putting this all basically in Omaha. I'm like, I know where 11th is in Omaha, and I basically know what this town would have looked like back then.
Well, and and there were not a lot of Swedish Lutherans there.
Okay.
So most of the people there were Catholic and Southern European.
So were there other Lutherans but not Swedish Lutherans?
Yes.
And was it at that time Swedish Lutherans wouldn't have felt super comfortable with other Lutherans?
No, that was not an issue at that point.
So they could have been a part of the other Lutheran churches.
Absolutely.
But he was like, we've got our own style, and it's
there was just there was an organization called the Board of American Missions that tried to spread new churches in new neighborhoods and so on and so forth. And it was at a time when racial animosity was starting to percolate a little bit in Gary. And so it was an interesting time to be there. But at any rate, I can remember, getting back to the issue about when I first encountered God, saying my prayers every night, where you would have 3 or 4 prayers that you'd, say every night before you went to bed. And the church was right next to the parsonage again in Gary. Both had been built after my dad got there. And it was right behind the elementary school where I went. And one of the profound geographic circumstances in Gary was there's sand everywhere. It was just, it's at the south end of Lake Michigan, and everything was sandy. Our backyard was sandy,
So the lake just delivered silt and sand
right, exactly.
to the whole area.
So, but it made the houses filthy, anyway.
No, that's interesting. And was it good soil? Could you grow stuff there?
Well,
you're a gardener now.
Yeah,
I don't know. Looking back
my dad probably brought in black dirt, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you lived at the parsonage then. The parsonage is a house.
Parsonage is a house, and there were
your
2 bedrooms. It was
the
second floor.
How many siblings again? I'm sorry, do you have at this point?
I have my brother.
Just your brother. Do you have any other siblings beyond
Yes, I have a sister who was born in 1955, which was at the tail end of our sojourn in Gary.
Okay.
But
so you have
your first 10 years or 8 years of life or something are
Well,
in
so
Gary?
it was fourth grade when we moved.
Oh my gosh, right. So it's a little bit later. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So then you're saying prayers. What was your father like at home then? I mean, was he,
Well, the office was at home, and he was always around because he didn't go anywhere. The church is right next door, so that he had an office in the house and worship services over at the church.
Was he a soft power kind of leader, or was he somebody that was like could he get very passionate about?
No, he's a soft power.
Yeah.
He was very reasonable, and I think I came to know him as pretty liberal, pretty pragmatic, I think is the better way to put it, so that he did what needed to be done without any doctrinal restrictions.
So he felt. So he was liberal in the sense that
putting words in his head.
Well, but what you're saying is you sort of saw him as someone that didn't necessarily always live by the book in some way. Like he was a devoted leader, but he was also
he made people welcome no matter what their religious backgrounds.
Yeah,
special. and
probably at that time also
right.
probably
Exactly.
unique.
Right.
I imagine.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's a good place to stop for the quick break,
Okay.
and then we're going to jump right back in.
Okay.
But that's it. That's segment 1. That's how fast it goes. We'll see you right back here. All right, we're back with Dr. Ronald Peterson. And so we're just going to jump back into, you have another major move as you're growing up. Your father moves to Madison, Wisconsin.
Right.
And so tell me what happens there and why he moves there.
Well, he was starting a new mission there.
Okay.
And there was a church downtown called Swedish Lutheran Church, and they were going to have another Augustana church in a new neighborhood, which is called Meadowood, and it was on the far outskirts of the city. I can remember visiting Madison as a child, and they had a parade of homes, and we visited that, and there was one home that was just spectacular, that had a finished basement. And
right, that's a big deal.
And it had a tile basement and so on and so forth. And actually, it turned out to be that would be the perfect place to have as a parsonage, because you could use the basement as a worship space once the church was organized. And in fact, the Board of American Missions did purchase the house, and it was great. We had 3 bedrooms. The school wasn't built yet. We had to take a Badger bus down to the Nakoma Elementary School, which is about 5-6 miles away, and so it was a great place to.
So you would be. So is your father called by the organization to move? Is that what happens? He's in Gary and he gets a call and he's like, "You got to go."
There was an organization called the Board of American Missions, which went around strategically to figure out where it would be good to place new ministers and develop new congregations, and the Central Lutheran Church was interested in doing that and actually had some members in the area that could provide foundational members for this new congregation.
Okay.
And so that's what they did. We moved there in 1956. The new church was organized in 1957. The services were in our basement.
Until the church could be built.
Until the church could be built.
So you're living in a house where, how many services is he doing a week?
Well,
it's not just one on Sundays.
Well,
he's probably doing
but
things in the middle of the week.
That'd be during Lent and Advent, but mostly, and I can't remember if we had one or I think we had 2 services at that time, as I remember. But
is he running community things also throughout the week?
Well, it's interesting.
You're
trying to establish a new church there, and it was an element of pride for him if he could beat the milkman because there were 2 competing dairies, Bancroft and Bowman, and they welcomed new people. My dad got stuff from the Chamber of Commerce, and he tried to welcome new people before the milk companies got there. And
wow.
And so you'd have an idea of who was coming in when, because the realtors had that information out. My dad would be somebody to welcome them and say that we have this church here. Where's the Catholic Church with St. Maria Goretti? Where's this congregational church is here? So it was not necessarily. But in this day and age, who comes to your door and proselytizes. You don't anymore.
No way. I mean, it's a fascinating time.
But my dad...
He's like a salesman.
Well, yeah, my dad would and this is a metric for the Board of American Missions. How many calls are you making?
Wow. I mean, this is true salesman type statistics.
And so, because, and growth was very important because there was a financial investment.
Right, revenue.
And so on and so forth.
Right. Because then you wouldn't call it tithing probably.
And it was an issue because Meadowood, specifically at that time, did not become the growing suburb. There was another area of Madison that grew earlier. So I don't know this, but I think there was some pressure from the Board of American Missions that that you need to produce.
So what are you learning as a child at this time, right? Like I feel like I'm getting kind of two strong impressions, right? One is a very kind of sensible businessman. Like clearly your father was just an incredible organizer. Essentially, he's a producer of this organization. He produces the show. He gets the people involved. He's going around drumming up the money. He's, these are kind of like entertainment terms for this, but he's essentially bringing all these people together under obviously a very missionary zeal on behalf of God, but he's putting together a show. He's bringing together the community so that he has his weekly worship. And so you're seeing kind of a business sense. How is that?
As a child, you become very invested in the success of how many people are coming and so on and so forth. And again,
right, it's more big. You're almost seeing the business
the church
more than
but it was there's a worship there. It was an interesting set of circumstances because my mother would always make Sunday dinner, which of course is right simultaneously about the time with one of the services, and people would come up the stairs and. It smells pretty good.
Right.
Think we should stay.
So she's always making extra.
My brother and I would, as we cleaned the basement, would arrange the chairs, for the Sunday service the next day. So so that the metrics were very important, and we were a key element of the youth program, the only youth program.
Oh, of course.
Because confirmation class, ours was 5. And so that you sort of assume a responsibility to be a leader.
You're like a deputy leader
exactly.
Under your father,
right,
who's
exactly.
also guiding this.
And
program
I can
as well.
remember I usually sat in the front, row just to the left,
So are you? Do you? But you're not talking. I don't. What's interesting is, and I'm sure you will talk about this, but you're not expressing a lot of devotion to the literature or to the word to some extent. How much are you as a child invested in the word and the spirit of what he's talking about? You're talking a lot about, which is
right.
Understandable. You're talking about like the business aspect of it, growing the numbers, helping your father facilitate the job.
It's really not until you get to confirmation where you start learning about the gospel and so on and so forth.
Were you punished or anything for being out of line, or you were just, first of all, I guess it sounds like you were just you were very obedient.
We were never spanked or anything like that. Were
you an obedient group of siblings?
Yeah, I normal.
Yeah.
My brother and I fought, and so we it was just normal kids growing up.
Yeah. So around confirmation, you said
Well, confirmation is when you learn all Luther's catechism, the small and the large catechism, and they had questionings at that time where you'd go in front of the whole congregation, you'd answer questions that you had to memorize, and so that to be confirmed you had to have some education, and so we. Yeah,
but I mean, so that's not a big deal for you. You know this by heart,
right.
Okay, so, and you had mentioned that your grandmother wanted you to had sort of hoped that you would follow your father's
my
footsteps.
grandmother, my dad's mother was an incredible person. For example, when they were building the first building, they could not get a loan from a bank because there were not enough people. This is in 1957, 58. They didn't hand it out. My grandmother got 4 other farmers together, and they put their assets together.
Wow.
To guarantee a loan of $25,000, $5,000 apiece.
Wow.
That then
which is a lot of money at that time.
Still
a lot of money today.
The church cost $53,000, I remember, and so that That's what they were called mission partners. But that's the kind of person she was.
Wow.
These
are some really skilled
devout people who put their money where their beliefs were.
Right, and skilled organizers.
Right.
You come from a long line of educated people.
Right.
And I only say that because, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, they came over and they worked on the railroad. And so they're very blue-collar and very devoted and, hardworking and built up beautiful families and things. But you come from a leadership set of generations, it seems like. My mother is Dutch, and so they can trace their history back really far. Can you trace your history back pretty far through Sweden?
Yes, back to about the 1860s or so.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And, the original settler there who bought all the farms and the land, was a John Peterson. And one of his sons, for example, went to Vienna to study. He was a musician. And he ultimately came back to Augustana, which is where I went at the Swedish Lutheran College in Rock Island. He directed the Hannibal Oratorio Society, and this is about 1900, 1915, 1916. So these are talented people.
So we were talking a little bit at the break about the term PK.
Yeah.
What does PK mean?
Preacher's kid.
Preacher's kid. I was making the joke that I thought it was like penalty kick. Doesn't feel like that applies. But so now, can you start talking about what does that mean to you as you're growing into being a teenager, you're growing into high school, you're now growing into independence? At that age too, at this generation, independence, we still talk about being a teenager and having independence, but independence from most of the people that I talk to of my parents or grandparents' generation, independence happens even earlier at that age, right? You have to be getting your mind together on how you're going to support yourself much earlier.
I was a student. And studied hard, and was quite active, in drama and so on and so forth, and choir and band.
Oh wow! So you were a performer.
And band.
Cool.
And at West High School.
Cool.
And so, so that was kind of and conventional. Didn't rebel. Was involved in the youth group, which is called Luther League, and it was actually a leader in the state organization where we had meetings that went all over the state and so on and so forth. So, and then I ended up going to Augustana, which is a Swedish Lutheran College in Rock Island, Illinois, which at that time was a college for the whole Augustana Lutheran Church, and about 50% were from the local area, that being Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin, and 50% from all over the country. And it was a great school, and remained real active there, and took religion. It was not a real conservative school, but they had chapel twice a week. You weren't required to go.
Fascinating.
But and religion, you had 4 religion classes: Old Testament, New Testament, and then the religions of the world, and one other elective. So that religion was part of your core curriculum. And I remember our particular religion professor, bless his heart, he always loved sort of sticking it to you as far as the lessons go, because all these people who've been to Sunday school all the time, he liked disrupting their assumptions, and sticking them a little bit so that it kind of be a real challenge to their faith, and that was sort of how it started.
Okay, and so what does that mean to you? So is that the first time you're challenged?
Well, yes. You certainly you learn about the books of the Bible. You learn, you start to think about things in a different way. No question about it.
Well, let me ask you. I guess I haven't even established this. Are you do you still practice as a Lutheran today?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you've.
I was president of the church council, and very, very conventional, and. So yes, and I go I think I'm the only one of our siblings who still do, but I go to Sunday, every Sunday, and.
So do you, did you watch, so you continue to find a sense of home and kind of peace and comfort in the church and the ritual.
Our church is a very socially active church. that does lots of mission. It has my wife, who was a social worker after being a German teacher, was at a halfway house that where church bought a home, and has had women that needed housing, and she was the one who helped manage them through that transition, and she did that for 10, 15 years. So the church has very active kinds of programs, and used to be in Bangladesh, now in India, so that they're socially very active in their ministries, and that feel real comfortable with that.
How did you respond to your siblings? You sort of mentioned your siblings, like as you watched your trajectory start to unfold, as you become, in your 20s at this point, and you start to see you have a younger brother and a younger sister, and you said they don't practice anymore.
But that's now.
That's much later in life.
Right.
They practiced for a long time. Did they have children as well?
My sister has 2 daughters.
Okay, so they kind of. But for many, many years, while your father was still alive, I don't know when your father died, but
he died at 90. So
in 90?
At 90 years of age.
Oh, okay.
So
what year is that?
1910.
Oh, okay. So he died in 2000.
2010.
Oh, 2010. Okay. Mm-hmm. There's no real disruption as far as the family lived in a sort of cohesion as far as the faith that you maintain. You would
right.
There's no disruption.
When I graduated
father.
from college, my attention turned to my career. I was going to be a doctor, and met my wife, who was from Omaha.
Mm-hmm. Oh, really?
Yes.
Did I? I don't think I knew that.
Yeah.
Well, no, I did know that, although I'd forgotten today when I saw her again.
And originally I
knew that because Amy had told me that a long time ago.
I was originally going to be an internal medicine doctor. And then on Christmas vacation, we'd go to Omaha for a couple weeks, and Bill, Kathy's dad, was an obstetrician.
Oh, wow. How about that?
And practiced at Clarkson.
Okay.
And the University of Nebraska, and was quite an icon there.
Okay.
And so he had arranged a clerkship so that I'd spend my time being introduced to obstetrics at the hospital overnight and so on and so forth for about 2 weeks during my Christmas vacation, and I would scrub with him, as an assistant on hysterectomies and various surgery. And so that was my introduction to obstetrics, and I liked it.
Yeah.
And I liked it because it gave you a little bit of everything. Because, I loved doing the obstetrics. I loved the medicine part of the obstetrics, the high-risk obstetrics. The surgery was not all that complicated, and that was cool. And you were sort of at the ethical forefront also of medicine, with a lot of ethical issues up and down on contraception and so on and so forth. So I really liked that, and then that altered my career trajectory and put me at the University of Michigan, where I did my OB training. So
I did not think that I would go into this, but I was on a show called Masters of Sex, which referenced Masters and Johnson.
Yep.
And I didn't put it together that that would have been influential to you at the time, I imagine, right? Like that was kind of national.
They did sexual desensitization. We took some of those courses during medical school, Kathy and I.
Right.
It was.
Because he's older than you, but
right.
But so you would have been, as a student, kind of following maybe a decade behind most of his landmark sort of stuff, right? So by that time it's filtered into the training to some extent. The stuff that people wanted to filter into the training had started to filter into the training. Right. So you were influenced by them to some extent.
Yep.
This is interesting. Actually, you know what? This is a great place to take a break, and we'll come back for the third segment with Dr. Peterson in just a second. Thanks. Hi, everybody. We're back with the final segment here with Dr. Ron Peterson. And the question as we start into more of the deeper spirituality stuff of where you are today, do you feel like you hold the same spirituality as your father or the way you were raised, or how has it evolved over the years? And you were speaking about that through certain reading that you've done throughout your life, you've taken some deep impressions, and I'm not sure what those are. So please speak to that.
So it relates to my obstetrics as well. One of the things I really like to do is I read a lot. And
that sounds beautiful.
Sometimes I'll read 70
I don't read as much now that I have a
70
toddler.
to 80 books a year.
Wow.
And
wow. 70, 80 books a year is
And because I get a lot of time. The other thing that I do is I'm a really avid consumer of the great courses, which are lectures that are given by professors that are among the best professors in the world, actually.
Are you saying that the series is called The Great Courses?
It's called The Great Courses, and their business model is such that they employ professors that do lectures of 12, 18, 24, 36 on every subject imaginable. And they're fabulous.
And so you can you buy them online or something is the deal?
You can either get them online or you can get DVDs. I tend to get the DVDs. They have transcripts, they have summaries. And
so you can watch them or you can listen to them in the car or something, however you want to take it in.
They've got it online now so that anytime you can get access to a computer, you can listen to them. But they're on everything. Evolution,
how long has that
paleontology.
been around?
I've been doing it for 15 years.
Wow.
And they're fabulous.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Paleontology, all this. I mean, anything you want
the
to
one thing
listen
that
to.
medicine does is it focuses you very early in your intellectual, where you're doing chemistry, biochemistry, and so on and so forth. And it really doesn't allow you to complete the diversity of education you'd like to have. And so in addition to reading, I really listen to these great courses, and I think I'm their best customer. I must have about 60 or 70 of them.
That's amazing.
They give me, and I haven't listened to them all, but I've listened to lots of them.
Yeah.
And it's and the
You're
thing,
still an avid student,
right? And that's what I am doing in retirement, because it's so cool the things that you learn that have happened and that have been learned since I graduated from college. I graduated from college in 1969. The amount of knowledge that has occurred and unraveled in that time, unbelievable. And it kind of, it sort of all hangs together in a way, in paleontology, evolutionary studies, age of the earth, and religion. And one of the things that author that I read was Dr. Bart Ehrman. Now, Dr. Ehrman is currently the chairman of the Department of Religion at the University of North Carolina.
Is that like EHR?
EHR-MAN.
MAN. Mm-hmm.
And his background and mine are somewhat similar. I could really identify in that he grew up in a very conservative biblical family. He went to the Moody Bible Institute, which again is quite conservative. And then to complete that thought, he got his degree at Wheaton, which is, again, a very conservative, literalist Bible type of college. And he always felt, and I'm sort of taking this from the foreword of one of his books, but he always felt like the liberal theologians and theology schools never gave them any respect. And so he was going to correct that. And so he went to Princeton for his graduate studies, and his particular area of interest was in biblical studies and original biblical texts. And so he would go back and he became an expert on the Gnostic texts and the original manuscripts of the Bible. And what he found,
right, for those people that don't remember or aren't aware, the Bible has taken many iterations over the years. Different books have been excised. The Bible we have today that we refer to as the Bible has lost different pieces of religious literature because it was felt that it wasn't applicable or they didn't think it streamlined well. And one of them is the Gnostic Bible, right. the Gnostic Gospels,
which were buried.
Yeah.
But at any rate, there was no publishing done, of course, in the early Gospels. The way that things happened was monks would copy the various books of the Bible from one to the next.
Sure.
And mistakes would be made. Or people would make editorial comments or add things. Or even in one case, there was an ink that bled through to the other side of the page and completely changed the meaning of the word. And so that as you go back through the various texts in history, there wasn't until the Middle Ages that there was any complete uniformity because of the process. And for somebody who believes in an inerrant Bible where every word is something, that's a problem.
Right.
And that's just the first of many books that he has produced. And he talks about the gospel and Jesus in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and he actually has a number of courses in the great courses also. So that I must say that many of that was the impetus for me to delve back into history and corroborate that. The other thing that I learned in my reading, just general reading, is that the story that you learn about a particular person, historical person, or about a particular historical circumstance ain't necessarily what happened. And in fact, that history is a lot more complicated and dirty than people realize. For example, in Jamestown, when Jamestown was settled, they were terrible. The Indians, the settlers were awful to the Indians, massacred them at various points in time, dismembering them. So that you start to, and the same thing in Plymouth Colony,
right?
So that you start to realize that the story that you learn in history about various personalities or situations aren't the whole story. And that caused me to reflect, well, gee, wonder how does that apply to religious history? And you start to realize that the stories that you have learned in, like Noah and Adam and Eve and so on and so forth, that relates, about 3 or 4,000 BC, and man has been around for hundreds of thousands of years. When you have Neanderthal, and you kind of, you have to start to say, wait a minute, what's truth? Exactly who's got this story right here? And so that started a lot of thinking, and I really delved into ancient civilizations where, there were many civilizations, that dating back mainly to 10,000 BC that predated Noah and Adam and Eve. And you start to realize that there are natural explanations for many of the things that are in the Bible. For example, the earliest writing is the cuneiform writing in the Sumer, which dates to about 3100 BC, and that was usually to substantiate business transactions. There have been changes in climate that have been going on for eons, and the levels, sea levels have gone up and down by hundreds of feet that allow migrations to occur or civilizations to be lost. And so you start to wonder, now, what is true? For example, Noah's flood. Noah's flood happened at about 5800 BC. And it's at a time when the North American glaciers were melting, and there was a warm period, and it was very dry around the Euxine Lake. The Black Sea was originally a freshwater lake, and it was at a time of climate change when the area around Palestine and Ur and where Abraham had come from was very dry. There was drought, and so consequently, the civilized people of the world, concentrated around the Euxine Lake, and the Euxine Lake was a freshwater sea or freshwater lake.
Is it in between the Tigris and the Euphrates? Is it right in that area?
No, it's Black Sea. No.
Oh, it's Black Sea.
It's the Black
Okay.
Sea,
Okay.
right from Constantinople.
Okay.
And so what happened was that the glaciers in North America drained through the Mississippi and St. Lawrence, raised the levels of the seas, and broke through the Dardanelles, flooding the Black Sea 400 feet vertically and hundreds of miles laterally. And so that these civilizations that were congregated there had to move, and that was the great flood. And you say, well, How do you know that? Well, there have been people that have, from Woods Hole, that have done dives into the Black Sea. And you can actually see where it happened. In other words, below a certain level, the shoreline is much smaller, and those mollusks and so on and so forth were freshwater. Laterally, higher up, you can see that all of a sudden the mollusks and the animal life and so on and so forth were seawater.
Right.
And so that all the
So you're seeing the geological evidence.
So you're seeing, and it all hangs together.
Yeah.
So that, and this was 5800 BC, which was which was predated writing by 3,000 years.
Right.
And so this would have been carried down as an oral tradition that the various civilizations which followed one upon another as oral traditions.
Yes.
And so that at a time when the Bible says you've got Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and I can remember as you your mind being kind of compartmentalized. Well, where's the woman? They only got 3 or 4, and you're thinking, wait a minute, there are hundreds of thousands of people at that time.
Yes.
Not 3 or 4. And so you start to realize how you compartmentalize the lessons that you've learned and look at history in a completely different way and say, no, this, I don't buy this stuff anymore. So then where does your faith come down when your faith in the scriptures and the old stories are seen in a different light?
Great question. Where do they come down?
Well, it's a continual struggle, and I think that I feel comfortable. Is there a God? Is this all an accident? As you get into the details of evolution, it's hard for me to think it's an accident.
Hard for you to think it's an accident.
That it's an accident.
Yeah.
There are so many things and steps that have happened. And I could have. Evolution. There's no question in my mind as a scientist is the way that the world and nature changes. But we're still finding things that are unbelievably revolutionary. There's a thing called the archaeon, which is a type of anuclear organism, which has just been sort of understood in the last.
Totally. This is like archaic acid.
Archaeon. So it's, the process of life and genetics and so on and so forth is such that the ribosome, you have DNA and CGA and so on and so forth, and all these things have to fit, and then they translate proteins into tissues and so on and so forth, and you think it's hard. I mean, they make the case that this all happened step by step, and perhaps it did, but But
the question is there an animating force behind the steps?
Exactly, and the views of civilizations at times change radically in short periods of time. So who's to say there aren't parallel dimensions, so you don't, in my mind, you can't eliminate all the possibilities that we don't know, because the next new discovery may contravene or contradict the doubts that you have about the existence of God and is active in the world.
This is wonderful stuff. I don't want to derail this into my own stuff too much, but I have only recently in my life, over the last 5 years, really put together all of this research as well, all of this old historical research, which I also needed to do. Where did humans come from? This sort of early Genesis story doesn't seem to make sense. And I started piecing all this together, which is why, thankfully, I was able to follow much of your very, very deep historical research, which clearly is like very dense. And for some people, might be hard to follow. A lot of people don't know some of these things, but I know this timeline that you're talking about. But it's great to hear, and I loved how you let it unfold. It was very erudite. But my question is, when you talk about the struggle, are you still struggling with Jesus Christ as the Son of God, or have you sort of been able to kind of let that live in a place of, since you're putting everything else in historical context, you are probably trying to put Jesus in historical context, and is that a struggle for you, or is the larger struggle, it seemed like what you were referencing wasn't Jesus in particular or specifically, it was more you were referencing, is there a God force? Is there a God that wants us specifically to be where we are and used evolution? This was kind of the intelligent design argument, right?
All of the above.
Okay, yeah.
In that, who was Jesus?
Right.
Was he the Son of God?
Yeah.
And what does that mean? It meant a different thing in the times of Rome, because being the son of a god was not all that unusual.
Okay, right.
I mean,
yeah, no, of course we have
and so there are different worldviews at a particular time. Polytheism.
Yeah.
So Mark in the Gospel says that Jesus became the Son of God at the time of his baptism. Remember, the dove came down. Mark
is the earliest gospel too. This is like the most original we can get.
And there's a totem at the end of Mark that who knows where it came from, because it doesn't fit with the rest of the book.
And most scholars, as I think that what I've discovered is that most people, the earliest they'll put Mark is about like 30 years after Jesus died,
exactly.
Right? Like 60 AD,
right? Exactly.
Right? So like at the earliest they'll give Mark is it was written 30 years after Jesus was crucified by timeline.
Then you have Matthew and Luke.
Right.
Who have totally incompatible birth stories.
Right.
Who believe that Jesus became the Son of God at birth or at conception, because you remember that you have the Annunciation to Mary, who the angel tells her that it will be the Son of God. In Matthew, the similar story. John, totally different.
Yeah, right.
Who is written the last, who said that God or that Jesus pre-existed all that.
Right.
So what do you believe? Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher who did not understand himself and never claimed to be the Son of God.
Right. Well, yeah, that's obviously a point of great contention depending on who you're talking to. But yes, it doesn't seem that if you're going to judge by the early stuff.
Well, if you go by Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
That's
John.
What I'm saying is that
forget John.
Yeah, right, because then you get into the magical realism stuff of like John and Jesus
but
knows
Matthew,
what he
Mark,
is.
and Luke, Jesus makes no claims to be the Son of God. He's the Father.
Right.
And it is his view that the kingdom of God is at hand, meaning now.
Right, yeah. Exactly like you said, apocalyptic, like it's coming soon.
Right. And to repent and so on and so forth. That's a different message than you get in John later.
Yes. And
so that the early church struggled with who was Jesus anyway?
Right. This is the historical Jesus is one that I studied in college. This was during my attempt at trying to understand, and Mary being a devoted Christian, and the fact that some of these things were falling apart for me, is that you could kind of get behind the idea of him as a revolutionary, and then you can start to get into like it's not called revolutionary theology, but it's called liberation theology. So you start to get into that stuff, and I studied in the Dominican Republic for like a semester in college, and it was sort of under the auspices of a sort of liberation theology idea. But eventually, so then you can kind of celebrate his revolutionary idea, but then it's kind of like what you're also forgetting is like he was apocalyptic, which is a different thing than just revolutionary.
Right.
And so
he predicted the end of times. He thought it was coming right then.
Yeah.
Right during the Roman Empire. And then the church has had to reset its message and goals and thoughts periodically, both Judaism and Christianity, because it didn't happen.
So that, by the way, that was awesome. I have only so much time left. So I want to ask you a question. Where then... You talk about the struggle of this. You clearly are such a deep thinker and researcher on this. Where do you find then where do you find the most sense of like peace and spirit? Where is your faith and spirituality the most comfortable or the most resonant to you? Do you tend to leave... You research these things as historical search, but it sounds like maybe you leave it at a certain point, and
there's a corporateness to the church that I think is important.
Important in what way?
Well, I think it gives the church meaning, and I think Jesus did have a revolutionary thought, which is do unto others as you would do unto,
Yes.
the golden rule.
Yes.
Which is different than many other religions and the assumptions.
Right.
And so that I think that's the essence. The problems I have with Christianity particularly are the exclusivistic claims it makes, because I don't think that that's accurate. And I think that historically it's necessary for religious groups to maintain that they are the only way, just as a proselytizing kind of thing.
Right.
But, who's...
Cohesion, group cohesion.
And
it created community and safety and
exactly.
trust.
But I think there are more than just the way of Christianity. And I think, there's currently a morality play going on before our eyes when we're talking about global warming. Because, it's like the people during Noah's flood, none of which wanted to believe that there was a catastrophe on the way, and who did not make any preparations. The same thing is happening right now. And they believe it in Europe because they're at 115 degrees right now.
Yes.
So that
well, we've been up. I live in North Hollywood in the Valley, and last year I saw my car temperature went up to 130 at one point.
Right. So that's a concern I have. You have a small child. I have grandkids.
Yeah.
You try to think of their life when we are ignoring what is in front of our face without the urgency. Because, this is an incredible time we live in. There are so many, scientific capabilities. We understand so much. We have the resources. And all we need is the will and the unification of purpose that we had like in World War II.
Yeah,
right. When they
you understood the enemy.
Right. You understood the enemy and you mobilized every possible asset to conquer it.
Man, this is great stuff. I think I have to say goodbye. Ron, thanks for coming in, man. This was really great.
Thanks. It was fun.
I really appreciate it. I thought this was beautiful. It's you offered some really extraordinary perspective on a lot of stuff. And as a lover of history, we got to go down a deep, deep dive in a lot of different ways. So I deeply appreciate it. And thank you all for listening.